This is Robert Sungenis coming to you from the Principal Facebook page for October 24th, 2019. Sorry, I'm a little late tonight. I'm having trouble with my modem and things are not moving very well. So if for some reason we get cut off tonight, you'll know why. Warning you ahead of time. I don't know if we'll last an hour or not, but here we are in the grip of modern technology. We sink or swim according to whether it works. Hopefully we won't have any problem, but I can just see the images flickering as I speak. So again, we are here, so let's make the best of it. And as you know, this program is set aside for you each week on Thursdays, Eastern Standard Time from 7 to 8 p.m. Sometimes we go over. If there's a lot of questions to get to, I try to fill them in as much as I can. And last night, for example, on another Facebook page, I went over by 45 minutes. So we were on the air for an hour and 45 minutes. And so I will make those accommodations as I see fit with the number of questions that come in. But now this program here is set aside for questions you have on The Principal, our movie that debuted in October 2014, 5 years ago. Exactly. I think it was actually this date, the 24th of October. We were in the theaters in Chicago, Addison, Illinois, as a matter of fact. And that was the first showing of Principal. I think we stayed there, maybe a week. And then we moved to LA and then about 15 other cities in the latter part of October and continuing through 2014 until April 2015. So, as you may have, since you may have seen the movie and you have questions about it, please take this opportunity to ask questions about it. That's what I'm here for. We couldn't cover everything in the movie. It was about a 90-minute movie for the theaters, and that's all we could do. But, as you know, we put out a sequel to The Principal about a year later called Journey to the Center of the Universe. That wasn't in theaters, but it is available on DVD, and you can purchase those. Let me turn around and get samples of it. Okay, so here we have The Principal. I'm trying to get the glare out of there for you. Let me see. Hard to maneuver around here when everything's backwards. Anyway, there it is, The Principal. The universe has tried to tell us something. Are we listening? Okay, an hour jam-packed of stuff you'll never get anywhere else. That is the God's honest truth. We have very famous scientists in this movie, like Michio Kaku, George F.R. Ellis from South Africa. We have Max Tegmark from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. We have Lawrence Krauss from Arizona State University. Who else do we have? Bernard Carr is in there. He's from England. We have Julian Barber. He's from England. And let me see. Ron Hatch is in there too. Ron Hatch just died about a week ago. Suddenly. So you get your last glimpse of him in The Principal. And a few other people, myself included, Martin Celbretti, Robert Bennett, my co-author of Galileo Was Wrong. We have, see, now I'm getting old. I'm forgetting everybody's name now, even though in the movie. There's a couple other guys in there too. So well worth the money you pay for it. $14.95 for the DVD, or you can download it or stream it. And that's available at the theprincipalmovie.com. Okay, and then, as I said, the sequel, Journey to the Center of the Universe, 4.5 hours for your viewing pleasure, covering all the details that weren't covered in the principle. So as you can see, there's a lot of them. If it's 4.5 hours long, that is available. Okay, so, and we have the books available also that I just wrote and published here, Geocentrism for Dumbskies and Smart Kids, 250 pages, all color pictures. That is available on the robertsongenis.org website. Not available on Amazon. As a matter of fact, none of my material is going to be available on Amazon because they're very hard to deal with. And so you can find everything that I've written, any movies or whatever, from robertsongenis.org. So tell your friends, relatives, countrymen, anybody within your influence that these things are available, okay? And of course, we have the old standby, the big behemoth, volume 1 out of 3 volumes, and they're all about the same size. People wonder where I get the time to write all this stuff. And I can tell you this, I have a good wife who keeps a tight ship, allows me to do the work that I need to do. And so she makes it all possible. This is Galileo was wrong, the church was right, the evidence for modern science, 2 volumes of that. And then we have a 3rd volume, which is the evidence from the church and fathers and scripture and all that, volume number 3. So these are, again, are available. Now this one is available on the Journey to the Center of the Earth.com website. Not available on robertsongenis.org, although we probably should put it on there too. Anyway, so if you want to get familiar with all this, please make this a purchase. You help us out, keeping us alive by purchasing books and DVDs and all that. Just want to let you know. Okay, so that's available. I had a call today from a person in Italy, and he's a medical doctor, and he was searching the internet, came across our material, and he saw the principle. He said when it went on DVD, and he was just enthralled with all the information that we have, and so he wanted to order the new movie I have out. The original title is The Fool on the Hill, and the title is changed for the YouTube watchers, and it's called Einstein, the Closet Geocentrist. So we talked about that for a while. I told him about my ancestors in Italy, and he was telling me he doesn't live far from them. And so we had a good talk for about 15 minutes. But so in other words, people from all over the world are tuning in and getting into the discussion and finding out what they haven't been taught in grade school, high school, and college, and even postgraduate. People are becoming familiar with all this topic. So I find that very exciting, and I am much more optimistic about how the news is spreading. And so I'll continue to be here until the day the Lord takes me, and I'll try to help you out. So let's go to your questions to see what's available tonight. So, as usual, Ben heads the top of the list tonight. And he says, Robert, what are your thoughts on Planet X? Is it on a collision course with Earth? Also, given that the universe revolves daily around a stationary Earth at the center, what accounts for things like Halley's Comet, which only shows up every 75 years, and meteors that sometimes hit the Earth? These things don't seem to fit the mold of the universe revolving daily as a unit. Thank you. Okay, Ben, good question. Let me do the first one. Let me do the first one first. Planet X, a collision course with Earth. Well, that's what a lot of people would want you to get all hyped up about. That's possible. Anything's possible. anything is possible. So to exclude the possibility that planet X or planet Y or planet Z, if we should find them in the future, could not hit the Earth, well, that would sure be, speculation, that because nobody can predict the future. Okay, if we know meteors hit the Earth, then certainly something bigger that could hit it. An asteroid could hit it. They're like little planets out there between Mars and Jupiter. As a matter of fact, there was an asteroid that came within a few million miles of Earth just last year. Okay, so now the thing about an asteroid, there's thousands of them out there between Mars. They call it the asteroid belt. And if one of them gets loose somehow because of some other force that loosened it from the asteroid belt, there's a possibility of that happening because there's so many asteroids out there. But planet X, there's only one planet X, and the likelihood of that being loosened from its orbit is certainly a lot less than an asteroid being loosened from its orbit. Okay, the planets revolve around the sun. Okay, even in the geocentric model, the planets revolve around the sun. Okay, that's called the tychonic or neotychonic geocentric model. And so the planets revolve around the sun. The only one that's missing, and it's not a planet, is Earth, because Earth is in the center of the universe, and the planets go around the Earth. Okay, but those planets, let's say you just go by Newtonian physics, the local physics for forces that modern astronomy uses, without even talking about the universe rotating around the Earth. If that's the case, then there are certain forces that keep these planets in their orbits, and there's no possible way they're going to deviate from it. You see, they revolve around the sun by, as Newton said, by inertia. On the one hand, it's a linear force, and then the other linear force is gravity that's trying to pull the body in, and the result of that is a curved orbit. When you have two linear forces meeting, the result is a curved orbit, and that's the orbit that they follow. So to take a planet, whether it's planet X or Pluto or Jupiter or Mars, whatever, out of our orbit, that would take a force that's greater than the two forces that keep it in its orbit. Where's that force going to come from? Not too many forces out there in the solar system that are going to keep it, that are going to dislodge it from its orbit. Okay, and those orbits are very precise. So even more so, is it going to be harder to get it out of its orbit. So if planet X is revolving around the sun, and it might be outside the orbit of Pluto, the one possibility is the sun's gravity out that far is not that great. Okay, so the further it is away from the sun, the less force it's going to take to dislodge it, if it dislodges. So, but that force would have to come from somewhere. Where's it going to come from? The closest object that we know of so far is Alpha Centauri, or Proxima Centauri. It's actually a double star, so it can be called by either name. But they say that that's 4 light years away. So that's a long ways. So, where are we going to get the force for planet X? There might be something out there we haven't taken account of, that could dislodge it. But what I'm trying to say is I think this whole thing about planet X is more hype than it is fact. Okay, so I would not be worried about it. All right, so I think your second comment or question is about comets, like Halley's Comet. Okay, so your question is, how would that occur in a geocentric universe if the Earth is the center? Okay, well, just like the planets revolve around the sun, all right, whatever forces are there, whether you want to look at it from the Newtonian model or the Einstein model or the geocentric rotating universe model, okay, all of that you see in the heliocentric model, where Halley's Comet comes in every 75 years, goes around the sun, then goes out beyond Pluto, and then comes back again. All of that is exactly the same in the geocentric universe, okay? Let's just take the Earth out of the picture for the time being. Let's just say there's the sun, and there's 8 planets, including Pluto, okay, because I'm not ready to put Pluto in the graveyard into oblivion like modern science is. You know, it's got a strong elliptical orbit, but that doesn't mean it's not a planet of the solar system. I don't know why they ever got rid of it in the first place. Maybe they had nothing to do one day and said, well, let's just get rid of Pluto. And, you know, I've grown up with Pluto. I like Pluto. So, you know, at any rate, everything you see that works in the heliocentric universe is going to be in the geocentric universe, okay? Geometrically, it's all the same. The only thing that's different are the centers have changed, okay? That's it, basically. And, you know, in order to get a good picture of this, you should get our flash drive, or at least our CD-ROM that has the animations of all these movements, comparing the heliocentric against the geocentric. And you'll see that they're basically identical, except that the centers have changed, okay? So geometrically, they're all the same. And you're going to get Halley's Comet in the geocentric universe just as well as you're going to get in the heliocentric universe, okay? Because it's all controlled by the sun. Gravity and inertial forces and all that, it's all the same. And so basically you're going to see exactly the same thing. There's really no difference at all. But I think in order to get a good grasp of it for yourself, look at those animations we have. There's like 60 of them that we made. You're never going to find them anywhere else. We're the only ones who've made them. You may find a couple primitive ones on the internet. Some of them are actually better than ours. I'll admit that. 1 or 2 of them are actually better. But we have the most because we cover every aspect of what you would see in the heliocentric as opposed to what you see in the geocentric in every possible area that we could think of, so that nothing is left undone. That would be probably the best way that you could visualize this similarity between the heliocentric and geocentric systems, okay? Hope I've answered your question. All right, so let's go on to, everything seems to be working well today. I don't know what the problem was with the internet prior to me getting on here, but let's just see. Okay. Adam says, how would you respond to your critics like David Palm, who assert that you can't have your cake and eat it too by, on the one hand, using Einstein's relativity to bolster your geocentric position, and on the other hand, rejecting relativity theory? More. Thank you. Okay. Thank you for asking that question, Adam, because it gives me a chance to clear it up. The objection that I find this objection rather funny, because on the one hand, if they think that I am trying to undermine Einstein's relativity theory because it's wrong, and yet they believe in Einstein's relativity theory, how is it that they can condemn me for using Einstein's relativity theory when they actually use it themselves for their particular model of the universe? You know, I just find that kind of contradictory, hypocritical, okay? So that's just like a basic criticism of this objection. The second way to look at this is, when we say that we're against Einstein's relativity, it's a much bigger pie that needs to be sliced properly in order to figure out what we're saying, okay? We reject Einstein's special relativity theory, okay? That's the theory he made in 1905. And we reject that because it's basically absurd, that theory. And you need to know the reason why that theory was created. That theory was invented because of the Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887. And that's just not speculation. That's exactly what Einstein said, that the first path to the special theory of relativity was his trying to answer the 1887 Michelson-Morley experiment. And what did that experiment show us? Okay, well, that experiment was set up to try to prove that the Earth was going around the sun. And if that was the case, if the Earth was going around the sun, then there should be some resistance to the light beams in Michelson's experiment that would retard the speed of light. Okay, we knew pretty much, what the speed of light was on Earth, 186,000 miles per second, because it had been measured. One of them that did the measuring was Michelson, and there were a few others. Okay, so the question was, if the Earth is going around the sun at, say, 20 miles per second, all right, 30 kilometers per second, we suspect that because of the experiments we've done on Earth with light, that light would be affected in some way. That is, its speed would be impeded, all right, because it's going through space. Now, at that time, they believed space was composed of ether. Whatever, you want to define ether to be, it was a substance in space, okay? In other words, space was not empty, and that only, jived very well with philosophical angles, in the sense that if space is nothing, that means it doesn't exist, because nothing cannot exist. Okay, so everybody understood, at least from a philosophical viewpoint, that space had to be a something. They may not know exactly what it is, but it had to be something physical, because the other side of that coin is, if it's nothing, well, nothing can exist. You see, you just can't say space is empty, because if it's empty, that means it doesn't exist. There's nothing there. You see, we live in a physical world, so you can't make up, terms to sort of satisfy yourself by saying, well, it's nothing, and then we don't have to account for anything out there. No, that's not the way it works. Okay, so they believe that if it's traveling through this space ether, that the ether is going to affect the speed of light if a light is discharged in the direction that the Earth is supposedly moving around the sun. And what did they find? What they call a null result. In other words, they expected an impedance of the light beam commensurate with a speed of 20 miles per second around the sun, and they didn't get anywhere close to that. Okay, they only got at least perhaps 1/10 of that speed. Okay, so maybe 2 miles per second is what they found in Michelson's interferometer. So everybody's scratching their head, wondering what the heck's going on. If the Earth is moving around the sun, we should have an impedance of the light beam commensurate with 20 miles per second. But we're not getting anywhere close to that. And so they just chalked it up to, well, something's wrong here. We'll have to figure out what it is. And 5 years later, Hendrik Lorentz, a Dutch theologian, came along and said, well, here's the answer to that. When Michelson did his experiment, he shot the light beam in the direction that he thought the Earth was revolving around the sun, but because the ether is out there, the ether compressed Michelson's apparatus, the experimental apparatus, and shortened it. So if you shorten the apparatus, you're going to have a shortened result. So what you thought you were going to get, 20 miles per second, only turns up to be 2 miles per second. Okay, so that's the way he explained it for that day and age, in the late 1800s. He was the only theologian. Actually, there was one other one, George Fitzgerald from Ireland, who basically came up with the same theory, that somehow Michelson's experimental apparatus shrunk while the experiment was taking place, and the ether was the thing that shrunk it. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, any scientist worth his salt knows that you can't use as proof the very thing you're trying to prove. Okay? You can't assume that the Earth is revolving around the sun, and then give the answer by saying that revolution around the sun made Michelson's apparatus shrink. Okay. That's called petitio principii. It's a logical fallacy. Okay. Now, Einstein comes along and says, well, you know, I don't like this idea that Lorentz came up with, that ether was the thing that shortened the interferometer arm of Michelson's apparatus, because if there's ether out there, then that means we have an absolute. Okay, we have something against which we can measure everything else. Okay, whatever you want to call it, ether, schmether, whatever it is. There's something out there that is going to basically upset my relativity theory, because if you have something that's an absolute, then you can't have any relativity, you see. So he decided that he was going to he was going to do away with ether, yet he still needed the shrinkage of Michelson's apparatus, because he admitted that that was the only way to explain this very small result that they got. Okay, so he said, well, we'll blame it on the fact that the speed of light is limited. And so the front of the object, the speed of light that reaches my eye, can't come at the proper time, because the object is just moving too fast in order for the light beam to hit my eye from the front of the object as well as the back of the object at the same time. You see, something of that sort was what his explanation was. All right. So what did Einstein basically do? Well, he made the same mistake that Lorentz did, in that he assumed that the Earth was moving, and you can't do that if you're trying to prove that the Earth is moving. Okay. So that's number one thing that's wrong. Number two is he just arbitrarily got rid of the ether, okay, and said that space was a vacuum, and basically pretended that space was a nothing. Now, you can't do that either, philosophically speaking. You can't say space is nothing, because that means there would be nothing there, and therefore it wouldn't exist, okay? Again, we live in a physical world. This is not a spiritual world which we're talking about, okay? So that's number two. Number three is he assumed that the speed of light was constant, that it couldn't change. And he himself called that a postulate, a hypothetical assumption, you know, that had to be true in order for his theory to work. But he had no proof that light speed was constant, okay? But he knew he needed light speed to be constant if he was going to say that the Earth was moving. And basically, so he had two choices. Either he accepts that Michelson's results show that the Earth isn't moving, or, and therefore the Earth is constant, let's say, okay? Or the other choice was to say that light was constant in its speed, all right? Both of those would have been an absolute. An Earth not moving is an absolute, because it's not relative now. The speed of light not moving is also an decreasing or increasing in speed is also an absolute. Okay? So that's another mistake that he made. First, he assumed that light was constant, and now, because he wants to support relativity, he needs an absolute. And so he chooses light as his absolute, in order to say that everything else is relative, okay? So in this relative universe of Einstein's, the only thing that's absolute is the speed of light. Well, that's very convenient, okay? Can't do that. That's not how you do science, all right? But, you know, his assumption was taken as gospel because they had no other explanation for the Michelson-Morley experiment. If they didn't accept Einstein's explanation, as absurd as it is, and they went through all the points of why it's absurd, then they would have to go bow to the Pope and say, we're wrong, and we've been wrong for 400 years for saying that you were wrong in condemning Galileo. Okay? Who in their right mind is going to do that? Especially a guy like Einstein, who was a totally anti-Catholic. His wife had converted to Catholicism in 1905, along with her children, and, you know, he just fluffed it up to something he couldn't control, but he was an atheist. He was a practical atheist. Some people say that Einstein believed in God. He did not believe in a personal God. He believed that the universe was God, basically, and he said he followed Spinoza in that idea. Okay, so do you think he's going to bow to the Catholic Church and say that modern science has been wrong for 400 years? No. Okay. What he did was, out of the two choices, whether the earth is constant or light is constant, he chose light as his constant. Okay. So that's the theory of Einstein's that we totally, think is absurd. And we've written about this many times. Now, there's a second theory that Einstein had called the general theory of relativity that he invented 10 years later. Okay. Now, that theory has some truth to it. Okay. So in that sense, we don't reject Einstein's general relativity in a fundamental way, and I'll explain what I mean by that. General relativity follows what we call the general principle of relativity. Okay, outside of Einstein, there's a scientific theory called the general principle of relativity, and that was believed long before Einstein came along. Ernst Mach had developed this theory of the general principle of relativity. Okay, wherein you were not talking about the speed of light anymore. What you were talking about is the dynamic forces in the universe, which ended up concluding that just by force laws, you could have an Earth in the center, fixed and not moving, and the universe rotating around it, or you could have a situation where the Earth is rotating and the universe is fixed. Okay, that's what Mach told us long before Einstein came along. As a matter of fact, Einstein read Mach's book, and that's how he developed his general principle of relativity. Okay, which is different than the general principle of relativity. Okay, make sure we make those distinctions. And then Einstein developed the oddities of his general relativity theory by going beyond Mach. And then he said, well, in the general the general relativity theory, we have such things as black holes and wormholes and time warps, and gravity is caused by a warping of space and all this kind of stuff. So he went way beyond Mach and into his own ideas of how shall we develop the general principle of relativity. And more or less his math required him to go to that length. Okay. And so that's the difference. In other words, the difference of what we hold on to is the general principle of relativity developed by Mach and used by Einstein, but we don't go to the extent that Einstein went in his general relativity theory and claim that there's black holes, white holes, wormholes, time warps, space warps, all this kind of stuff. Okay, we don't go in that direction because we think that is going off the edge. It's all speculation. It's all theory. All right, that may be where Einstein's math took him, but that doesn't make it right. Okay, so that's where we part company with Einstein. But the fact that he overlaps with Mach, we can use that. Okay, because that's not Einstein's theory. Okay, it was Mach's theory to begin with. All right, and Berkeley had those ideas before Mach did, and so it was a developing idea where force dynamics now were relative, not just geometrical systems that could be the same. Because even in Galileo's time, in Copernicus's time, Kepler, they all knew that geometrically it was no problem converting a heliocentric system into a geocentric system, because the geometry is very simple. Just a matter of, switching centers and drawing the right circles. That's all it is. But explaining things by force dynamics, that's a whole other ballgame. Okay, the only one who really started that ball rolling was Newton. And, with his famous equations, F equals ma, and the force of gravity equals G times M1, M2 over R squared, all those were very helpful to them, but he was the first one to develop force dynamics. But what was his problem? Well, Newton's problem, as pointed out by Mach and Einstein, no less, was that Newton confined his system to our solar system. Okay, our solar system, and disregarded the rest of the universe. As a matter of fact, he thought the universe was infinite, and that led to the idea that it was absolute. In other words, it couldn't move. It was just out there as an absolute. And so everything that he saw in the solar system, that's the only thing that counted, because that's where he saw things moving. The universe wasn't moving, okay? So if you develop your whole dynamic force system based on just the solar system, well, of course you're going to come out with the idea that since the sun is the larger mass, then the Earth is going to have to go around it, as will all the planets and the asteroids, the comets, everything. It's going to have to go around the sun, because the sun is going to contain the largest mass, and therefore the center of mass is going to be in the sun or just right around the sun. Okay, so yeah, I would agree, if we were just stuck with the solar system, yeah, Newton wins the day. All right, but then Mach and Einstein came along 200 years later and said, well, wait a minute, what gives you the right to limit the system of investigation to our solar system? Why don't you expand it to the universe? There's forces out there, aren't there? We have stars out there, okay? And if our sun is a star, and you believe that has gravitational force because of its mass, what about all the stars out there? That's what started Mach off, all right? And then he said, if you work out the equations, he said, what you're going to come out with is that there's really no difference between a universe of stars rotating around a fixed Earth as opposed to an Earth rotating in a fixed universe. Both the same. You're going to get the same dynamic equivalence. All right? So, and yeah, I agree with that. All right? Newton's outdated. All right? Because he couldn't show why he opted for an absolute universe. All right? So once you get to that point, now you're in the general principle of relativity, because that says that there's no difference between a fixed Earth in a rotating universe or a rotating Earth in a fixed universe. Okay, so forget about the rest of general relativity. This is all we need. Okay, and the only time we would refer to Einstein is again because he overlaps with Mach in that particular area. Okay. So this whole idea that, we can't use Einstein, it's typical of David Palm using just half the story to try to convince people that his view is right without telling the whole story. Okay, and if you tell the whole story like I just did, then you understand why we can refer to Einstein at times to support geocentrism, because Einstein did overlap with Mach's ideas. And it's to our advantage, because if Einstein overlapped with Mach's ideas, well, don't we have the right to point that out? Here's Einstein himself saying that the universe could rotate around a fixed Earth. All right. Now, Mr. Palm doesn't like that because it just destroys his whole critique of geocentrism. If the greatest scientist in the world that he thinks is the greatest is saying that geocentrism is a viable scientific model because a rotating universe can go around a fixed Earth by the theory of general relativity that believes in dynamic equivalence, there's nothing wrong with pointing that out. He just doesn't like it. Okay? So he's the one that wants his cake and eat it too. All right? He's the one that wants Einstein all for himself without sharing it with those times that Einstein overlaps with the general principle of relativity. All right? So that's where that animal's coming from. Now, let me just say one more thing about the general relativity theory. Because this, to me, is just the complete evidence of blindness in modern science. They found their idol and they're going to worship him, and his name is Albert Einstein. And they're not going to let go until they are absolutely forced to let go. And here's how we know that. As I said, the theory of special relativity was invented to combat the Michelson-Morley results, so we could keep the Earth moving or make it appear as if it was still moving, even though the experiment showed it wasn't moving. Okay? And the way you do that is you make light constant and you make Earth move. That's how you do that. Now, in addition to that, I should say this first. When you make light constant in the special theory, then you're going to have to believe that length contracts when bodies move and the time dilates, because those are the factors that balance out the fact that you just kept light constant and the Earth moving. Okay, those are the balancing factors. But how absurd is that, to claim that when an object moves, its length contracts? Has anybody ever measured that? No, no one has ever measured that. There are some that claim that they measured it, but I've examined them. They haven't. They haven't shown how you can measure length contraction. Okay. And then believe in time dilation. The times changes, it increases, okay? And that, you have to have that, all right, in the special theory of relativity. Before I get into that, and I don't want to spend too much time on that, I want to go back to general relativity. Now, general relativity was invented because when Einstein invented special relativity, he didn't add in gravity or inertial forces, okay? He just said, if you exclude gravity, exclude inertial forces like centrifugal force, Coriolis force, and you just have this pristine environment, okay, well, light speed is always going to go the same speed, okay? But do you know anywhere in the universe where there's no gravity or inertial forces? I don't know of any, okay? So this whole thing about special relativity, to answer Michelson's experiment to keep the Earth moving, has no application in our universe because there's no place where there's no gravity, okay? So Einstein recognized that, so he had to basically supersede the special theory of relativity and allow the general theory to incorporate gravity and inertial forces because, yeah, they're ubiquitous. They're all over the place. Every part of the universe has them, so we better deal with them, okay? So he did that, and you know what that developed into? You guessed it. Light was no longer constant. The speed of light was no longer constant because once you subject a light beam to gravity or inertial forces or both, it's going to change. It's going to change its speed. It's going to go faster or slower. So he recognized that. So that was changed. And since we know there's gravity and inertial forces all over the universe, that means anywhere a light beam is, it's going to be affected by those forces and go faster or slower. Okay, so this whole idea that light speed is constant could not be applied. The only thing he applied it to basically was the Michelson-Morley experiment, and that was to keep the Earth moving so that we didn't have to bow to the feet of the Pope. Okay? Now, what else did Einstein do in his general relativity theory? Well, you know that very ether that he said didn't exist when he critiqued Lorentz's view? Well, he took that back. He took back the ether. Took back the ether. Now, this is amazing because he needed to have no ether in the special relativity theory so that he could keep light constant. And he needed to keep light constant because that means the Earth would move. Okay? But now he's reinserting the ether all over the universe. He says, yeah, it does exist. We can't do without it. And I was wrong to say it didn't exist in the special theory of relativity. He admits that in his book. I was wrong for taking it out. Now we're going to put it back in. But what does that do? Well, that just destroys the whole special relativity theory because special relativity says there is no ether. And it said that, why? So it could keep the Earth moving. So if you put back the ether, what does that do to Michelson's experiment? It makes light non-constant, and it makes the Earth constant. It makes the constant, the non-moving Earth, the real reason why the Michelson-Morley results were null, because it's not moving. If your light beam isn't going through the ether 20 miles per second, it's not going to be affected. That's why you're going to see a null result. Okay? So Einstein said the speed of light was not constant in the general theory, and he took the ether back. What kind of, I mean, come on, people. Look at this. They totally contradict one another. All right? And they call me crazy for believing in geocentrism? I mean, and you know, they try to hide this as much as possible. When you take physics in college or a postgraduate, whatever, you tell them that Einstein said the speed of light wasn't constant, they look at you cross-eyed. Well, no, he taught that, you know, yeah, that's the special theory. Okay, did you know he just said the very opposite in the general theory? Okay, and did you know the very ether that he rejected in the special theory he took back in the general theory? Did you know? Well, I didn't know that. Well, go read his works. You know, you claim to be a teacher of Einstein. You know what Einstein really believed? Yeah, check it out. It's all in my book. I put it in every book that I write about geocentrism, because even today's scientists don't know it. You know, and so there's an agenda here. All right, and then we have the I know it's almost 8 o'clock, but I'll go on here if there's a few more questions. And then we have this other experiment in 1925 that Michelson did with another partner named Henry Gale. And that one, he said, was designed to measure the rotation of the Earth. Okay, not the revolution of the Earth around the sun. The 1887 experiment was designed to measure the Earth's movement around the sun at 20 miles per second. Okay, but I said, you know, we never did measure the rotation of the Earth. So he set up this experiment. He used the same equipment that he used for the 1887 experiment, except that he reoriented it to catch the rotation of the Earth. And what kind of results do you think he found? Now, remember, the 1887 experiment to measure the revolution around the Earth didn't measure the revolution around the Earth because there wasn't any. It only produced about 10% of what they needed. So they just had to say, well, it doesn't show the revolution of the Earth, because you can't have half a revolution. You can't have 1/10 of a revolution. We know the revolution, if it occurs, is going to have to occur in 365 days, 0.25 days. Okay? So they had to say, well, it just doesn't measure the revolution. But now he's measuring the rotation of the Earth. And what do you think he found? Almost 100% of the ether drift that he needed to equal the sidereal day of 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4.1 seconds. Yeah. He actually got 98% of what he needed. That's amazing. You know, you measure for the revolution of the Earth, you know, what, 38 years prior? And now he's measuring for the rotation and didn't get any result. Now he's measuring the rotation. He gets a full result. Full result. What's going on here? And I show that in my book, the headline of the New York Times that's writing about this. And you ever want to see an absurd article in your life, read that one in my book. They had themselves twisted over a barrel on this one because they don't understand it. And neither did Michelson. Michelson didn't understand this experiment. How could that happen? You know, on the one hand, he was happy because he found the very ether that he'd been looking for. Okay? All these years, because he knew instinctively that Einstein was wrong when he said there was no ether. because Einstein, or because Michelson even got 1/10 of the result that he needed. So that meant some ether was out there. Okay. So how do you deal with that? It wasn't a totally null result from Michelson-Morley experiment. How do you deal with that? So he knew instinctively that something was out there, and Einstein kept denying it, and Michelson kept doing his experiments to prove Einstein wrong. And so he finally did this in 1925 for rotation. He finds a full ether that he's looking for. Wow. Now, Michelson didn't understand it because, you see, what he had done with the Michelson-Morley experiment was he said, okay, how am I going to explain this? That there's no ether affecting this light beam. How am I going to understand this? So he said, okay, maybe this is it. Maybe the ether is moving along with the Earth. And so when I shoot the light beam from Earth, since the ether is moving with the Earth, there's nothing that's really going against this light beam because the ether is moving with me. If the ether was standing still and the Earth was moving through it, then the ether would affect this light beam 100%. So Michelson says, okay, maybe the ether is entrained with the Earth. Maybe that, and that's what he believed for all those years. And then he comes to the 1925 experiment, and he finds just the opposite of what he thought was going on, because the ether was showing a drift against the light beam of 100%. You know, like both were moving against one another. The ether wasn't entrained with the Earth when the Earth was rotating. If it was entrained with the Earth, he would have a 0 result. But he had a 98% result. Okay, but if you, like Michelson, believe that the ether was entrained with the Earth, and then you found out that it wasn't in 1925, what other option do you have now? Here's you got two options. One, that somehow Einstein was right about special relativity, and what's the other option? The Earth ain't rotating. Okay. So which one do you think that he's going to choose? Well, he's a Copernican just like everybody else is. He's not going to say that the result is caused by the fact that the Earth isn't rotating. And what's the other side of that coin? Well, if the Earth isn't rotating, that means the universe is rotating around it, because that's the only other way you're going to get the result that he got in 1925. You got a 98% result, remember. Okay. So if the Earth isn't rotating, it's fixed. The only other object out there that could cause the ether drift against the light beam is a rotating universe. Okay, but that option, you know, we can't have that option. Because again, what would that mean? It would mean that we have to go kiss the feet of the Pope and become Catholic. Can you imagine? No. So all they had, once you reject the fact that the universe is rotating around a fixed Earth, you have nothing left. So you're going to go for Einstein's special relativity and think that somehow is going to answer the question. Okay, but it doesn't. We've already went through that. It doesn't answer the question. All right, because Einstein's special relativity theory said there was no ether. So how can you say that Einstein's special relativity is going to help you explain the Michelson-Gale experiment in 1925? You can't. Okay, so yeah, now you can see why we cut and slice Einstein up, you know, and we'll only use him when he hit on some truth, you know, just like a stop clock is right twice a day. All right, he hit on some truth, so we'll capitalize on that. All right, so that's this whole thing with David Palm. All right, let me see what else we have here tonight. Jonathan says, what has been the general reaction among traditional clergy to the Principle movie? Oh boy, I would love to tell you stories about that. Look, see, Jonathan, once you accept the principle and its thesis, then basically the next step is to be a geocentrist. Okay? And there's something about being a geocentrist that they just don't want. See, this is like a real paradigm shift for them. You know, they've held science in such high esteem, and most of these, you say traditional clergy, don't know squat about science, physics, astrophysics, astronomy. They know a little bit, but not enough to even know when or where or why to support it. And they have succumbed to the aura of the scientist in the white lab coat who is totally objective about the science data he gets in his telescope or microscope. That's the spell that they're under, okay? And they don't realize that these guys in white lab coats are just like used car salesmen. When it comes to defending their cosmology, that's all wrapped up in their atheistic philosophy, they will fall down on their sword to back up all the anti-Christian interpretations that could possibly be used, whether it's the Big Bang, dark matter, dark energy, you know, inflation, whatever, multiverse, whatever it is. They will fall on their swords for those theories because why? They have already rejected the fact that there is a creator who's going to make them responsible for their sins. Okay? So they won't do it. And the traditional clergy, they don't know clue one on how to refute these guys because they use fancy equations and they got fancy theories. And, you know, they're the only ones that could look in a telescope and look at this data and know what they're looking at and interpret it in such a way where they give their opinion. See, traditional clergy hardly know anything. And the ones, the clergy that do know something about it, let's say like Guy Casamagno, who's the head of the Vatican Observatory, he's sold out to modern science. He believes in evolution. He even believes there's aliens out there that someday may come to Earth and he'll baptize them. Now, what kind of nut is this? And I don't say that lightly, okay? But he's all sold out to them. I had debated him once, probably about 10 years ago. One thing he did understand, though, was that the general principle of relativity will not let anyone deny the geocentric model. He did admit that, and I appreciate him for that. Okay, he's one of the only ones to admit it. This is right in our debate that we had on the BBC. Okay, so at least he sees it, but you know, but he'll do everything he can to destroy geocentric doctrine because of the two options, he's going to side with the one that modern science sides with, the heliocentric. Okay, he's made that quite clear. Even though he knows it's a possibility for geocentrism, he won't give it the time of day. All right, and so this is the kind of mentality that's out there. Now, there are some traditional clergy, very few. I know a couple of them, and they believe geocentric doctrine, not only from the science, and little they understand about it, but basically because the church said so. And these are traditionalists who really believe in tradition. Okay, there's a lot of traditionalists out there who believe in tradition only insofar as it agrees with what they want to believe in. And the other part of tradition that they don't want to believe in, well, that's just, you know, we can ignore all that. And the geocentric thing is a perfect example. You know, our fathers, the fathers that we're supposed to look to for doctrinal truth, believed unanimously in geocentrism, as opposed to the Greeks, that some of them believed in heliocentrism. The fathers all based their idea on the Bible. What does the Bible say? The Bible says the earth doesn't move. What's that imply? That implies there's geocentrism because that means everything else is moving around this fixed object. Okay, every one of them. As a matter of fact, I don't know of a single doctrine that has the absolute consensus of the fathers other than geocentrism. Okay, the closest one to come to that is baptism, baptismal regeneration. Okay, so not only that, but the 1566 Catechism Council of Trent Catechism teaches geocentrism. Doesn't give the time of day to helium. Doesn't even mention it. Okay? We had 2 popes that said Galileo was wrong. In 17 years apart, they were, and said he was wrong. Said he committed formal heresy. Okay? So on we go. I mean, our whole tradition is filled with this, if you just look at it. All right? But a lot of our traditional clergy, somehow modern science must have got it right and the church got it wrong. That's their attitude on this. Or they're a little ambivalent about it, and because they don't know how to support it scientifically, they'll just let it go and just say, well, it's not important. Not important. If there's anything that's important, it's this. Because if the Earth is in the center of the universe and not some rock out there in the remote recesses of space, as Carl Sagan said, that means that we're special. And that means that the only way we got in the center was because somebody put us there. And if somebody put us there, he must be a lot greater than us. And if he is, and he created us and the Earth in the center, that means he's going to require a lot from us, don't you think? Yeah. He's going to make us responsible for our lives. And he's going to look at every sin that we've ever committed. Well, that's the part that they don't like, you see. That's the part that they don't like. They want to get God as far away from them as possible. That way they can live and die and not be responsible for what they did on earth. How convenient. And they know that an Earth in the center smacks of God. They know that in the heart of their being. I know because I've read their material. That's what's in Galileo Was Wrong, that big thick book I just brought up here about an hour ago. All their quotes are in there. Okay? So, yeah, this is what's at stake. Okay? The other thing is, a lot of traditional people will get embarrassed by the fact that, we have to support geocentrism. We'll get embarrassed because, it's going to look like we're these medieval people who can't progress and advance like the rest of the society, that believes the opposite, and they're going to look askance at us, and and then our whole message is going to go down the tubes because they think we're so stupid, and the excuses just go on and on and on. All right, and I've seen them. That's how I know. All right, so that's what we're up against. Okay. So anyway, I think I've preached long enough on that one. Hiroshi says, dark energy 73%, dark matter 23%, stars 3.9%, Earth share 0.03%. That's basically the totality of the cosmos, courtesy of Professor Michio Kaku in one of his Big Think video lectures. But how did they come with that menu? Oh. Well, because they think the universe is expanding, okay? And so they measure the mass of the universe. They measure the acceleration that's taking place. And they got this so-called acceleration in 1998 from their view of the candlestick stars called candlestick supernovas, called 1A supernovas. So not only was the universe expanding, now they had to say it was accelerating, okay? So if you have this much mass in the universe and it's accelerating this fast, that means accelerating means it's going faster and faster and faster, okay? It's not going at a constant speed. How much energy are you going to need to keep this thing moving? All right, you can measure that out. That's easy. You know the mass, you know the acceleration, okay? You have M, you have A. What does that equal? F, all right? So where are you going to get the F from? If they're going by F equals MA, Newton's law of motion, what's the F going to be? Well, the F's going to have to be the same, to take care of that mass and acceleration, all right? And if you want to divide it up so that you have enough energy, because the dark matter is going to be a lot less powerful than the dark energy, you're going to have to load up the side on the dark energy side. So that's why you have 73% dark energy. And we'll use the dark matter as sort of a fill-in, not only to keep the universe accelerating, but we also need it for the galaxies because they're spinning way out of proportion to Newton's laws. So we'll have to add some dark matter to them. And we know how many galaxies are out there. So yeah, we're going to have at least 23% of this force be dark matter to keep the galaxies rotating the way they appear to be rotating. All right. And then, you can add the stars in, big deal, and the Earth, big deal. The basic thing is the dark energy and dark matter. Okay. So, and this is, again, it's like going back to Einstein. Okay? Him saying that there is no ether in the special theory of relativity without having any empirical evidence. As a matter of fact, he ignored the empirical evidence. The empirical evidence says there was at least 1/10 of what was needed. Okay. So how could you deny that it exists? Well, you just chalk it up to experimental error. So basically what Einstein did was say 50 years of experiments in one of the most important experiments ever done by modern science, over 50 years from 1881, the first one that Michelson did, until 1930 with Joos, Joos was his name. All of them did, a dozen experimenters did the same experiment, all found the same results, or right close to each other, that there was no Earth revolving around the sun because there wasn't the impedance of the light beam that they were expecting. Okay. So basically he ignored the empirical evidence. And that's what these guys do, the big bangers. Okay. Because there is no evidence for dark energy. There is no evidence for dark matter. And there is no evidence for inflation. All this stuff is made up in their minds. Okay? That's where it's coming from. Why? Because they need to keep the Big Bang alive, because they have no other alternative except the 6-day, 24-hour per day creation of Genesis chapter 1. This is a game of wills. This is the test of, who can convince people. And if they can't find the evidence, then they're going to manufacture it. That's what's going on. All right? I know that after being around this stuff for 40 years, you can smell a rat when there is one. And there's a big rat out there. Okay? So I don't know what else I have to say, but that's what's going on. All right? All right, see if there's anything else. Okay. Rick says Newtonian theory is being disproved every day, it seems. All the latest data is supporting the electric universe. Well, here's another issue. I mean, I know the guys who are doing the electric universe thing, and they have evidence up the wazoo. I mean, it's just, it really is. I mean, but they won't get a hearing. Okay. Modern science just throws it out. But this is what happens with science. It takes a lot of pressure to take the reigning theory and discard it. Because, I've heard of Swiss cheese with all the holes in it. But then what happens is there's so many holes that gets into that slice of Swiss cheese that there's no cheese anymore. It's just holes. It's just a big hole. That's what it takes for these guys to drop. And when that day's coming, who knows? But we're moving toward there. Okay. Someday somebody's going to say, what the heck are we following Einstein for? He's got two contradictory theories, general and special relativity. One has ether, one doesn't. One says light's constant, one doesn't. One has gravity, the other doesn't. One says the universe can spin, the other says it can't. I mean, come on. And then we're finding that general relativity doesn't agree with quantum physics. Okay, and all that stuff that they've discovered around the same time that Einstein was developing general relativity. And the more they developed, the further apart they went. Okay? And they're still debating that today. So there's going to come a time when this whole house of cards is going to collapse. And hopefully, we will have a voice then. Who knows? But, time will tell. But we have to start planting the seeds. That's what I'm doing, planting the seeds. All right, see if there's anything else here. Oh, well, let me just say this too about Newton, okay? Because you said that Newton's being disproved every day. Here's the thing. As I said before, Newton started out confining his system to the solar system. If you do that, of course, the Earth is going to have to revolve around the sun, okay? And so he made up this force law that said inertia, a moving object has inertia, so it will continue to be in motion unless compelled upon by a net external force. And so every object's going to go in a straight line. The only way you can curtail that is by having another force, gravity, that's going to pull that object. And so the result is going to be that the object's going to curve. Okay? All right. So that's one thing. But in that system, you're going to have a force called centrifugal force, where that object, as it's turning, is going to want to go out, but the gravity's pulling it in, okay? And that appears to be a real force, because you can measure centrifugal force. But in Newton's system, he couldn't believe that there was another force, because he already had inertia and gravity as the only two forces that he needed to have an object revolve around the bigger object. So what do you do with centrifugal force? Well, this is what you do. This is what Newton did. You chalk it up as an artifact of motion. And it becomes what he called a fictitious force. Okay? That's the only thing you could do with centrifugal force. Same thing with Coriolis force, just an artifact of motion. All right? But when you expand the system to include the whole universe, and you say that the universe can move, and it's not absolute, it's not infinite, okay, what's going to happen? Well, the rotating universe is going to have angular momentum. And angular momentum is going to create real centrifugal forces, real Coriolis forces, and real Euler forces. Okay? Real, the actual forces. Instead of calling them just artifacts, as Newton was forced to because he kept his system to the solar system, now when you expand the system, those inertial forces become real forces. All right? So the geocentric system is better because it explains what the centrifugal force really is. It's a real force. That's why you feel it as a real force. It's not just an artifact of motion. Okay? And it's interesting when you go in and analyze the difference between centrifugal force and Coriolis force. The centrifugal force, you can measure it out, put an equation there as to how strong that force is. Okay? So you would wonder that if the universe is rotating, wouldn't all the stars basically go to the rim of the universe and be stuck there as the universe rotated? Because the universe is going to have to rotate pretty fast to complete its journey in one day. So the farther out you are in the universe, the faster you're going to be rotating around to get back to the same point in 24 hours. So that means there's a lot of centrifugal force out there. And if that's the case, aren't the stars going to be at the rim of the universe eventually, if not already? The answer to that would be yes, unless there's another force to curtail that. And that's where the Coriolis force comes in. Okay? And you can measure this in the laboratory. That's what they've done. They know how powerful the Coriolis force is. And it just so happens that the Coriolis force is twice the magnitude of the centrifugal force. And the Coriolis force is an inward angular force. Isn't that something? So here we have, in a rotating universe, you got two forces, one going out and one going in. And the one going in is twice the value of the one going out. So what's that going to turn out to be? You guessed it. It's going to be such that all those stars out there are going to stay in that same orbit because the forces are balanced to make the stars do that. They're all going to go around the central axis of the universe. And which one of those stars? It's called the sun. And it's going to make the sun go around the center of mass of the universe, which is the Earth. Just like all the stars are made to go around by the combination of the centrifugal and Coriolis force, you see. So the geocentric system basically can explain a lot more than the heliocentric when it's confined to the solar system. You see, once you expand the system and include everything and you try to explain why those movements are moving the way they are, this geocentric system far outweighs the heliocentric system. We don't have to make the inertial forces artifacts of motion. They're real. We can explain why you feel that force. Okay? And you're going down in your car and you go left or right, you can feel the centrifugal force. Okay? We can see why hurricanes turn a certain direction in the north and then a certain direction in the south. Turn counterclockwise in the north, clockwise in the south. Two polar opposite motions. Why is that the case? Because it's because of the Coriolis force at the surface of the Earth. And if the Earth is in the center of the universe, it's going to divide the Coriolis force in the north from the Coriolis force in the south, and they're going to go in two opposite directions. That's how you can explain that. Okay? So there you have it. All right? That's why Newton's whole system is outdated. We need to get up to speed. And as long as they persist on counting on Newton as their solution and confine everything to a solar system, they're not going to get anywhere. Okay? So there's the expansion of the fact that Newton's been overturned many times. All right, so let me see what else we have here. TJ says, I guess you're talking about me. He says you're going to see the same thing with heliocentric and geocentric models. Definitely not. Well, TJ, I suggest that you get our animations. It appears to me that you just made an off-the-cuff statement without really knowing what you're talking about. Usually, you're going to want to investigate the opponent's illustrations, videos, all those kinds of things before you make a statement like that. I would suggest that to you. Okay? Yes, they are exactly the same. We just move the centers is all we do. Okay? And if you want to email me your address, I'll be glad to send you free of charge those animations. You can look at them for yourself. That is if you want to take the challenge. Okay? So you can email me at sungenis@aol.com. And I'll be glad to do it for you. Okay? All right. Rick says, speed of light can be changed. The Sapphire project has proven this by slowing the speed of light. Yes. So even in our terrestrial environment, without any reference to special general relativity, they have shown that the speed of light is not constant. It's always affected by its environment. Okay? I mean, let's take the GPS, for example. My good friend Ron Hatch, who just died, 2 weeks ago, he did the most work on this. And if you know anything about GPS, they have 3 satellites and they have a ground station. And they basically triangulate between the 3 and the one on the ground to basically show where you are on the Earth, okay? And how they work is one satellite will send an electromagnetic beam to another satellite. And then that satellite will send another electromagnetic beam to another satellite. And then they'll both, or all 3 of them will send electromagnetic beams to the station, ground station, okay? And that way, since light speed is so fast that you can, pretty much pinpoint where you are. But there's a flaw, okay? There's a flaw. Because when you send an electromagnetic beam from a satellite in the west to a satellite in the east, okay, that beam is going to go slower than if you shot the same beam from a satellite in the east to a satellite in the west by about 50 nanoseconds, give or take. Every time, all day, every day. That's what they found. Okay, so what's happening? Well, the universe is rotating with its ether from east to west. So any light beam that's going west to east is going to run into the speed of the Earth that's rotating. And that happens to be 1,054 miles per hour at the equator. Okay, so that's a sufficient enough speed to affect a light beam. And it comes out to be a difference of 50 nanoseconds, going from east to west as opposed to west to east. Okay, so there's another instance where the light beam is slowed because of the resistance of its medium. Okay, but of course, if you're like all these other guys out there who don't believe there's some kind of medium out there, because Einstein said there wasn't any ether, and they ignore the fact that he took the ether back, well, of course you're going to think that light speed should be constant. And there's a little trick these GPS engineers use to make the speed of light constant, because if it wasn't constant between GPS signals, then you'd end up in Timbuktu rather than Kansas City, Missouri. Okay, because the GPS would be off. And so what they do is they adjust the computers of the GPS to take into account this 50 nanosecond difference between east to west and west to east. And once you do that, then the speed of light will be constant between east to west and west to east if you go in and adjust the computer for the discrepancy. And of course they do that, and they don't tell you that they've pre-programmed the computers to take care of the discrepancy. And then when light speed is constant between east and west, because they did program the computer that way, they come out and say, well, you see, the speed of light is constant. That's how they play this game. Okay? If you don't believe me, go look up Ron Hatch on the internet and see what he has to say. He's the guy that has done the most work on this. And it's just tremendous work. Okay? So, let me see where we can go here. It's 8:30. So you guys are talking back and forth with each other on something. All right. Jonathan says, given the fact that popes beginning in the 1800s began erring by allowing geocentrism to be undermined in contradiction to the rulings of their predecessors in the 1600s and 1700s, does this not have a big impact against the sedevacantist theory that the Holy Spirit always protects the Pope from ever performing actions that would ever undermine the faith? Well, yeah, this is a little theological, Jonathan. This is not the place for theological, but since you're mixing it with the science, I guess we can entertain it tonight. Well, first of all, when Jesus said to Peter, well, whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loose in heaven. That whatsoever word, little word in Greek, aeon, it was probably one of the most important words ever put in the Bible, because what it means is whatsoever Peter declares as infallible, okay, will be made infallible by heaven. Is basically what that says. But Peter hasn't decided that everything Peter says is infallible. Only when he declares it infallible will then heaven be bound to have said it's infallible as well. Okay, so little catch there. All right. So the question are the anti-Copernican decrees that were issued by Pope Paul V in 1616 and Urban VIII in 1633, are they infallible? Okay. Now I go through that whole thing in two videos. You can find them on YouTube. Okay. And one is the status of the anti-Copernican decrees. You can go look that up. The status of the anti-Copernican decrees. And also in the new movie, Einstein, the Closet Geocentrist. Okay, so here's two views. Well, not two views like they're opposite, but two aspects of this, how we're going to analyze this. First of all, the criterion for papal infallibility was declared in 1870. All right, that's 250 years after the Galileo issue. All right, so what we know is that Pope Paul V, Urban VIII, had an inkling of what infallibility was, but it wasn't precisely defined until 1870. They had an inkling of it because, there were some major controversies in the early years of the church, like with Pope Honorius, where they had to basically decide whether he was a heretic for writing a letter that had a heresy in it to a bishop of the East. And they decided, well, he wasn't in his papal office at the time, so he wasn't it did not affect papal infallibility. That's what they said. Okay, so they were beginning to define it back then. But then as time went on, little controversy came up about, when's the Pope infallible, when is he not? And so 1870 was the time the church laid down the dogma and said, here's the criteria. There were 4 criteria. Now, if you go by those criteria, you can show that Paul V and Urban VIII did follow all 4 of those criteria. Okay, for example, making it universal. It wasn't a private issue with Galileo, because both popes wrote to all the papal nuncios and universities of Europe and said, here's what the church has decided, you are to follow it. As a matter of fact, if they didn't write back real soon to the Pope and give their answer, they were chastised by the Pope for not writing back and forced them to write back. So all of them responded. So in that sense, it's universal. Okay, it deals with the doctrine of the church because, the church said that if you say that there is no geocentrism, then you're disobeying the Bible. And the Bible's the Word of God, revealed by revelation. Okay, so there's 2 criteria right there. All right, the popes handled it, and 2 popes handled it. As a matter of fact, we had Urban VIII writing to Cosimo Medici II in Tuscany, trying to get him on his side to fight Galileo. And Galileo was a friend of Cosimo Medici II. But the Pope's totally involved. All right, and he's the head of the Holy Office, the very office that convicted Galileo of being formally heretical, or said he was suspect of that formal heresy. But that means that they had to declare the heresy first before they convicted Galileo of being suspect of it. So there you have another issue. Okay, you can't convict someone of being suspect of the heresy if you haven't previously defined what the heresy is and done so formally. That was already done in 1616 under Pope Paul V. They basically defined what they meant when they said that this was a formal heresy. Why? Because it makes the earth move. And it says the sun does not move from east to west during the day. All right? That was a big one. So there you have it. Here's the other thing. Someone will say, well, I don't know. I don't think Paul V and Urban VIII qualify for papal infallibility because it was a disciplinary issue, something like that, they'll say. Well, obviously, it wasn't a disciplinary issue. It was a doctrinal issue because disciplinary issues don't end up being formally heretical, okay? If the Pope's going to say it's formally heretical, the doctrine of Copernicanism, obviously it's not disciplinary. It's a doctrinal issue, okay? But let's just say they go off on that and try to find some other reason why it could not be infallible. Well, who's going to make that decision? It's not going to be the man in the pew, because those opinions vary with each man that you interview in the pew. What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? Well, they can all give their opinions. They amount to nothing. The only one that can tell us whether the papal decrees on the Galileo issue were infallible or not infallible is the magisterium itself. Okay? And there's been no statement from the magisterium. And that's one of the issues about papal infallibility, is the church has not issued a list of all the doctrines that were said even prior to the Galileo issue. These are infallible. Okay? That shouldn't be. we shouldn't have to play a guessing game as to what's infallible, what's not infallible. All right. The two statements that we have from the church that everybody pretty much knows are infallible are, the Assumption of Mary in 1950 and the Immaculate Conception in 1870. Okay. But are they the only two, infallible papal statements? What about Humanae Vitae in 1968 from Pope Paul VI, or Ordinatio Sacerdotalis that prohibited women priests in 1994 by John Paul II? They keep debating whether these things are infallible or not. It's been going on for 50 years. So don't you think it's time for the magisterium to come out and say, yeah, Humanae Vitae fulfills all the criterion of papal infallibility? But for some reason they haven't. And I wonder what's going on there. Okay. But the point is made that unless the church decides whether it is or isn't, no one in the pew has the right to say, well, I think it's not infallible, or I think it's infallible. All we can do is give the facts as we see them. And as I tried to do by showing that the actions and words that the popes took in 1616 and 1633 seem to fulfill the four criterion of papal infallibility. But I'm just a man with an opinion, okay? As I said in the movie, this needs to be adjudicated by the church to stop the confusion, okay? Will she do so? Yeah, I'm not going to hold my breath, especially in the kind of church we have today, where everything's up in the air, okay? Anyway, so I hope I answered your issue about the Sedevacantist thing, okay, there as well. And you go on to say here, clearly the allowance, wittingly or unwittingly, by popes from the 1800s to the early 1900s that allowed heliocentrism to go unchallenged and indoctrinate an entire generation of Catholics, academics, and priests is a direct refutation of this Sedevacantist interpretation of papal immunity. All right, so I've already answered that, okay? The Pope has to decide what is infallible. Now that will be kind of hard for Urban VIII and Paul V because there was no definition given by the church yet. And so they couldn't come out and say, by the way, these anti-Copernican decrees are infallible, because someone would say, well, what do you mean infallible? Where was that defined by the church? Okay, so we're a little premature with this discussion, so to speak, if we're just going to deal with the 1600s. All right. Someone could say, well, the papal infallibility defined in 1870 is retroactive, and of course it would be, but then who's going to decide? Retroactive to what? The anti-Copernican decrees, the decrees of Lateran IV about the Eucharist, all kinds of things come up. Well, tell me what's infallible, all right, so that I can know, because I don't want to transgress God's laws. I don't want to sin against doctrine of the church. All right, so, please clarify these issues for us. So, that could be coming someday, if the church lasts that long, that is. Jonathan says, question, are you familiar with the work of Immanuel Velikovsky? Yes, I am. Particularly his ideas about global catastrophism in his works like Worlds in Collision and Ages in Chaos, someone whose ideas are seriously considered amongst a growing number of adherents of electric universe theories. Yes, he's very involved in electric universe. I haven't had that much time, Jonathan, to really get into Velikovsky's work, but I have heard of him, kept him on the shelf. See, I have to gauge my time and what I'm going to read, because if I read something, that means I don't have time to read something else I wanted to read. And this is a constant battle I have. So I just know very little about him. I do know he exists. I know what his theories are, but I haven't had time to go in and critique them or exonerate them one way or the other. And even the electric universe theory, I've read some of their stuff and it seems cogent, but it just shows us more and more how bizarre the universe is compared to our feeble brains to figure it out. I mean, it's just so complicated. But how far I can take it I couldn't get into that with you right now, honestly. Okay, so I'll have to leave that. What are your thoughts about his description of events during the Exodus, Joshua, and the era of King Hezekiah? I don't know, because I don't know what they are. I haven't read that deeply into his theories. Maybe you can write back and say what he says about those, and I can give you my judgment right off the cuff, because I know those stories very well. And I assume with King Hezekiah referring to the sundial issue. Joshua, you know, we were dealing with the stopping of the sun and moon in the sky. And Exodus, not too sure what you're referring to there. But yeah, if you'd like to write back and tell me, I'd be glad to give you my opinion. Why did my question get skipped? Rick, I don't think I skipped your question. I think I answered it. I answered the Sapphire Project, and I also answered your Newtonian theory is being disproved every day. I commented on that. And my cursor won't go up anymore for some reason. And I thought I commented on another comment you had. So if I'm ignoring you, if I missed something, let me know. But as far as I can see, I haven't. Where can I watch the video? Amparo says. The video is on YouTube. Are you talking about the video that I introduced to you, Amparo? Einstein, the closet geocentrist, or the anti-Copernican decrees? If so, just go to YouTube and just put in Einstein, the closet geocentrist. It'll take you right there. It'll give you the link. And same with the other movie. Yeah, Jonathan says principle $3.99 for download. Yep. Oh, is that what you're talking about, Emperor? Okay. So there you have it. Looks like that might be it. Okay, great. Michael says he very much enjoyed the documentary. That is The Principle. Yes, by the way, folks, we just found a pirated copy of The Principle on YouTube tonight. And this is a big thing because The Principle, YouTube told us that The Principle is the most pirated movie that they've ever come across. So somewhere out there in the psyche of those who are fans, or those who think that it's legal and no problem with taking copyrighted material and putting it on YouTube. Okay, this is wrong. All right, very wrong. In being one of the most pirated movies ever made, we've lost a lot of money. As a matter of fact, we almost went bankrupt because of that. Okay, because pirated movies, and these movies will have sometimes tens of thousands of views before we ever catch them. All right, so, and some of them are made in other languages. Just like about a month ago, we found one made in Indian language. I don't know what the native language of India is. Some speak English, but then there's another Indian language. I mean, it was all transcribed in Indian. Then we had another one that's transcribed in Arabic. Another one transcribed in Chinese. You know, I mean, it just goes on and on. So a lot of this we can't stop. Okay, and when we do catch it, we send them a copyright infringement notice, and YouTube takes it off immediately. All right, but what I'm trying to say is it's not right, and our investors suffered, I suffered, Rick suffered, all because of this. And, you know, so what I'm telling you is if you see a pirated copy of The Principle on YouTube or anywhere else, please notify me as soon as possible. You can use my email address, sungenis@aol.com, SUNGENIS @AOL.com. and we'll get on it right away. Okay? So you can be my eyes and ears for me if you can do that, and I would appreciate it. All right. Someday, we might let it out for free, but this was an investment. It's a business as well as it is an education. And, I wish I could give it away free, but, it cost $2 million to make this movie. Okay. So somehow we have to come up with that money to pay back the investors. And, there you go. All right. So that's the way the world is. And I can't change it. And if we didn't have that money we would never have made the movie. Okay. So this is how we get return on our investors' investments. And so help me with that if you would. All right. So we are done for the night. Thank you so much for your questions. I hope I have been informative for you and solved some problems and answered some deep, hard questions. And as always, if I'm in good health and here, if I'm not here for any reason, like next Thursday comes and I'm not here, I mean, something came up that I couldn't get out of and I have to go, because there's no way I can warn you that there won't be a program. I don't think there is anyway. So, but barring any problems, any other appointments, any other engagements, I will be here next Thursday at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I think by then we'll change our clocks back, and to 8 o'clock, unless there's not a lot of questions and we'll go overboard. But I will be there for you and try to teach you anything I can from these topics. All righty, take care. Nice to be with you.